Podcast strongHER for the female athlete. In today's episode, Hard-Headed, we're going to look at headers in soccer and how they affect brain health and where science is taking us. So I kind of tired of this story because on November 2nd of 2018, so almost a year ago today, I was playing a soccer game. So I play in like a women's 30-plus league, and it was indoor. And a girl went to clear the ball, and I was standing probably 3 to 4 yards in front of her, and she kicked the ball, and it was coming for my head, and I didn't really have enough time to duck, but I had enough time to consciously process, okay, this ball's coming at my head, what am I going to do? And I decided to head the ball. I think the ball headed me more than I headed the ball, and I knew it was a hard hit. I kind of gave myself a second. But I didn't feel a headache, didn't feel dizzy, none of the normal concussion symptoms. And as a high school soccer coach, I have that list memorized pretty well because it's something that I have to look out for regularly. So when I thought about it, I was like, well, I don't feel anything, so I'm good to go. And I didn't come out of the game. I kept playing. That was in, I think, the beginning of the second half. So I finished out the rest of the game, another 20, 30 minutes, drove home, felt fine. Went to bed that night, and I woke up the next morning, and I went to get out of bed, and I sat up, and immediately the room started spinning. I had zero balance. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't walk. Basically, some of the more severe concussion symptoms had set in essentially overnight while I was sleeping, and I couldn't see straight. My vision was blurry. I had the headache, the nausea. I actually couldn't even talk properly, so I was finding it hard to find words. So if you've ever been talking and you forget what you were going to say, and you're like kind of stuttering, or you're talking really slowly because you're trying to find the words, that was kind of my normal speech at that point. I ended up having to take, I think it was full days off of work, and then a couple half days. And my doctor wanted me to take 2 weeks off of work. And unfortunately at the time I just couldn't do it. And so a couple months go by, and I'm like, okay, well, I still don't feel right. And a couple more months go by, and of course the really bad symptoms have gotten better at this point, but the headaches and the occasional blurred vision, those things are persisting, and I'm starting to wonder, like, what's going on here? So I ended up researching, and I found out about post-concussion syndrome, which is basically where you live with concussion symptoms for, it can be years after the incident, or it can last your lifetime. And unfortunately for me, I haven't seen much improvement in my symptoms, so I think I'm in it for the long haul, essentially. So nowadays, my main symptoms are I have headaches pretty much every day of my life, and it's a really weird headache. It's not in the normal place. It kind of feels like a ring that wraps around the back of my head. My point of impact, of course, was my forehead, which is, I hit it in the correct spot for a header, but the force, it didn't matter. So a lot of people don't understand that concussions actually work. The injury is often not where it hits you, but on the opposite side of the brain. So when that force hits your head, your brain moves in that same direction due to momentum, and then it slams up against your skull, essentially. So the injury is actually in the back of my head. And so that is where the pain is, but a weird kind of band goes around it and wraps around over top of my ears. And that's where my head pain is. So I have headaches pretty much every day. I don't take anything for them, but that's because I'm stubborn and I'm kind of like one of those anti-medicine people. I take it if I get desperate, but if I know I can get through it without medicine, then I don't take it. I sometimes have blurred vision. Maybe not blurred vision, but more like tired eyes, if that makes sense. And every now and then, if things get really bad, my speech will kind of slow down just a bit. And then I still have some sensitivity to light, like driving at night. Driving at night has always kind of been rough for me, but now I can actually feel it in my head. Like when the headlights are in my eyes, it's like a little twinge of pain in my head. So being a teacher particularly has been very rough. I'm also a master's student, and I'm an online master's student. So screen time is a huge factor in healing for anyone who's been through a head injury. And so unfortunately, that's not something that I can get away with. And I always wonder if that's really what is the cause of things still being as amplified as they are. So long story short, this is kind of why I became passionate about head injuries, especially in female sports, especially in women's soccer. I am a high school soccer coach. I've been coaching for, I'm coming up on my 7th season, and I've experienced many instances where my players have had head injuries or near head injuries where they've kind of walked it off and they genuinely have been okay. But it's something I take very seriously, and I didn't used to. I was one of those coaches, even players in high school, that was like, oh, my head hurts a little bit. I'm good to go. I'm going to keep going, and never really flinched. And I also didn't believe that heading the ball could give you a concussion. I guess I was sort of old school in that sense, and that I was like, oh, it's just heading the ball. There's no way that's going to give someone a concussion. And yeah, I definitely got checked, needless to say. And so now it's something that I'm passionate about, that I follow up on closely with my girls. And so I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about sort of the science of it and the statistics so that hopefully I can bring awareness to this issue. So when you look at the most recent statistics, there's a 2018 study published in Sports Med that kind of covers the number of concussions broken down by both gender, sport, and age. So the number of concussions for adult female sports is pretty high, and women's soccer is 5th on the list. So women's soccer is 5th below men's rugby at first, followed by men's football, and then men and women's ice hockey. Now, when you think of rugby, that's about as rough as it gets. And then football, of course, we kind of know everything that's transpiring in football in terms of head injuries. And then ice hockey, as a personal ice hockey fan, I've watched ice hockey people beat the mess out of each other and slam each other into glass walls over and over again. And so to think that women's soccer is 5th only beneath those sports is pretty shocking. The way that concussion tracking works is that they have what's called AE, which is athletic exposure. So if the athletic exposure is 1,000, that means that's equivalent to 10 games. So they create these statistics based off this idea of AE. So women's soccer is 1.48, which means that they, out of 10 games, so 1,000 AE, 1.48 concussions. Women's hockey is 1.63, men's hockey 2.27, football is 2.5, and men's rugby is 3. Men's soccer, interestingly enough, is just over 1. It's 1.07 compared to women at 1.48. And we'll talk about kind of why that is in a little bit. For youth, specifically, they don't do it gendered, so they just kind of give a general sport breakdown. And soccer is number 5 after rugby, ice hockey, football, and lacrosse. I was not fortunate enough to go to schools where they had lacrosse, but I've watched lacrosse, and it is very rough. There's people smacking each other with sticks. So again, soccer is kind of thrown in there with some of these really rough sports. And in a 2012 study, girls' high school soccer Concussions account for 15% of all the injuries. High school football sits at 17%, and girls lacrosse is the highest at 21%. So again, you can see that girls soccer continues to be high in the rankings. Really, the trick here is that as many as 50% of concussions are not reported. And so we have these statistics, but we don't know how accurate they are, considering half of concussions are not reported. And the reporting issue is something I'm very passionate about, and we'll talk about that as well. So, coming back around to why females have higher concussion rates, especially in women's soccer. It's not 100% clear. There's actually been a lot of research studies on it where they've hypothesized different things. And what they've ultimately come to are three things. Less neck strength. So men have stronger necks. Would you believe it? And so because they have stronger necks, essentially when they take a hit to the head, their neck takes some of that force, and their muscles, I guess, tighten up and control the hit a little bit. Women have weaker necks, so their bodies are less able to control that hit. Hormonal differences are also thought to contribute to it. Obviously, women have different hormone things going on, and reporting less often. So females in sports are often thought to report less when they have injuries. I always think of men's soccer, how, the flop. So when I think of professional soccer, men are famous for doing the flop and like acting like they're in agony, and then they pop up 2 minutes later. Women often just keep on trucking. So you can see, even if you watch a professional sport, women are just a lot more likely, at least in the athlete setting, to get hurt, get up, and just keep going. Versus with men, there's a little more drama to it. No offense, men. So I can totally see where the reporting less often factor comes into play. So these three things combined make, or at least they hypothesize that they make the concussion rates for females higher. And the big one is reporting less often. And if you're reporting less often, you're not getting the treatment that you need to recover as quickly as you need. So your brain can heal on its own, but if you're not seeing a doctor, that can take longer. So I'm going to cover the basics of a concussion before we kind of get into more of the science. So the CDC defines a concussion as a traumatic brain injury caused by a bump, blow, or jolt to the head, or by a hit to the body that causes the head and brain to move rapidly back and forth. So in plain terms, it's when the brain hits too roughly against the skull, and that's what causes the injury to the brain. It's almost like a bruise on the brain. And neck strength really plays into that a whole lot. Now, I actually have extra ribs in my back, and they're at the base of my C-spine, which is close to the neck. So I have had neck strength issues for most of my teen and adult life. And so I think that that's really what predisposed me to having more severe concussion injuries just from a header. But I think it's important to connect the dots between neck strength and headers, because there's a possibility that coaches could provide players with neck exercises or even build them into existing workouts. And potentially that could be a way to reduce head injuries. So some of the symptoms of a concussion, you might not be able to recall what happened before or after the concussion. So a lot of times if an athlete gets knocked out, they'll say, what time did you get here? Or where are you going when you leave here? They'll kind of talk about things that happened before or what's going to happen after the game. You can appear dazed and stunned. You can be confused or unsure about the game. So a lot of times the trainers will ask the athletes, what's the score? Who are you playing against? Basic facts like that they should be able to recall. You can lose your balance and therefore walk clumsily. And that can be just a slight bit of clumsy, or you can actually be like full on wobbling, which is what I experienced. You can talk slowly or even very slurred. Some people, of course, have a loss of consciousness. They black out. There's blurred vision. There's mood swings, there's nausea, vomiting, sensitivity to light and sound. The most obvious one would be the headache. There's also brain fog. So that's just a general feeling of like, I don't know how to explain it, but it's kind of, I experience this all the time, and it's just where your brain feels like cloudy and you just don't feel confident in any of your thoughts, and everything just kind of has like a haze around it. It's a strange feeling, but that is something that I live with regularly. And of course, with all these symptoms, it's important to note that they can happen as soon as you get injured, or like in my case, there can be a little period where you feel fine, and they will either all come in at once or slowly come in. So there's really no rhyme or reason to that. You just have to be aware of the symptoms. So ideally, most schools nowadays have an athletic trainer, and that sort of helps begin the process of healing from a concussion if it's identified. Basically, how it works is that, especially in the state of Virginia, we have the return to play and the return to learn protocols, where there's a recovery process that has 5 steps. And the athletic trainer follows the student through that protocol and essentially releases them back to school, back to the athletic field. Essentially, concussion recovery is pretty simple. Sleep a whole lot. You want to rest as much as possible. In terms of activity, it's just about taking it easy. So you want to gradually try to do more and only do as much as you can without exacerbating your symptoms. One big thing that helped me, and that is recommended for concussion recovery, is staying away from screens as much as possible, and then not doing like reading like novels in dim light kind of thing. Anything that would stress your eyes and then directly your brain out. So, not everyone, unfortunately, gets better. So I talked to you about post-concussion syndrome, and that's one thing that can happen. One of the most shocking things that I experienced that I totally did not expect was depression. So, and I started doing research at the time, probably about 6 months ago, because I was like, I think I'm depressed. And I started researching it, and depression is connected to a lot of head injuries, especially if you suffer from some sort of disorder or syndrome after the fact. And so I think the depression really stems from, well, A, your brain is just out of whack, but B, you don't feel like yourself, and you can't do simple things. You can't remember things. My husband, it drives him crazy because he'll tell me something and I forget like 2 minutes later. And it's kind of sad. I mean, I never realized how precious my brain is. I know that sounds weird, but I guess when you think about like legs and arms and toes and hands, you break those things, you lose them, life goes on, and life might be more challenging, but you can't really get a new brain. And once your brain is altered negatively, that's it. And so even today, I've dealt with the depression and kind of grown from that, but it's still really sad to think that my brain will probably never be normal again. Anxiety is also a symptom of post-concussion syndrome. That's sort of, now the connection hasn't really been linked, but many people who have post-concussion syndrome report anxiety. You can also get second impact syndrome, and that's when you return to play too quickly and your brain has not healed all the way, and you can get hit again. And second impact syndrome often results in death. I went to Longwood University in Virginia, and there was actually a rugby player who he had a bad hit and he came out for a little bit, and then he ended up going back in, and one more hit, it was that second impact, and he died right there on the rugby field his senior year of college. And so it's really important that coaches and trainers are present and do not let their players return to the field unless they are 100% sure that they're not experiencing some sort of head injury. So Um, Even a mild TBI, which is what we consider just a mild concussion where you have a headache for a couple days and then you're fine. Even that can lead to increased risk of later life cognitive impairment and neurodegenerative disease, which is pretty scary. If you have experienced a head injury at all, you can also be more prone to Alzheimer's and dementia in older life. And as the NFL has started to sort of look at and investigate, you have what's called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and that is, it's often, of course, just called CTE. That is basically early dementia, and many former NFL players are experiencing this, and a lot of them have actually committed suicide because of the fact that they've completely or mostly lost their memory at such an early age in life that they don't want to live anymore. In 2017, there was a study, and the New York Times article reported on it, where they studied 111 NFL player brains. There were 110 with CTE. And thinking how close soccer is to football in terms of the concussion statistics, that means that for soccer and women's soccer especially, that many, especially professionally, players are going to walk away with that extremely fatal disease. So something really cool when it comes to CTE and women's soccer, Brandy Chastain and Michelle Akers, who were both 99ers, the infamous World Cup champ team, they recently, just this summer in June, agreed to donate their brains to a CTE study on women's soccer. Boston University is going to conduct the study, and when they die, their brains will be donated to study CTE. Not only those two, but Abby Wambach has also previously agreed to donate her brain for the same purpose. I think when we think of soccer, we think of a lot of like leg injuries, but it's really crazy to think of it in this light with these heavy diseases that can be fatal. And so, like, why is soccer that dangerous? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about headers and the force behind them. So if you've ever watched a defender head a goalie kick back up the field, you have witnessed what is essentially someone getting punched in the head by a professional boxer. So a professional header of a goalie punt is 150 to 160 G-forces. Being punched in the head by a professional boxer is usually around 100 G-forces. So they're even exceeding that. The percentage of 100 G hits is the same between women's college soccer and football. So women are experiencing the same hits at the same force as football players being tackled. So the University of Sterling, they also did a study. They had 23 adult soccer players head the ball 20 times in 10 minutes. And then they studied their brains. In every single one, they found a change in brain chemistry. So just a normal header, not necessarily heading a punt, but just normal headers 20 times in 10 minutes. The brain chemistry changed. And then in an average of 54% of those 23 players, there were reductions on the memory test. So between the study of the G-forces of a header and then that study by University of Sterling on the changes in the brain, I have to ask, why are we still heading the ball in soccer? Is it essential to the game? Can we live without it? And for me at this point, I've come to start looking at it as a matter of life and death, especially at the professional level. And thankfully, the United States Soccer Federation, they've started to realize some changes need to be made. A couple years ago, they did ban soccer heading for athletes 10 and younger, and even for athletes 11 and 12, they are only allowed a certain number of exposures in a week. So they've also produced headgear for athletes now, especially for soccer players. I still play soccer now that I've kind of gone through the recovery process, and I do wear a headband that it's made of like really thick padding, and it catches some of the force if I were to head the ball. However, I have also made the rule for myself that if I'm going to continue playing, I'm not going to head the ball anymore. So my teammates know that if the ball's coming for me, I'm a defender too, so it kind of stinks. But my goalie, my other defenders, they know that if it's between scoring a goal and me heading the ball, that we'll lose. I just play in a women's rec league, and so for me, it's just not worth it, and my teammates respect that. So some other positive changes, of course, the return to play protocol that we have in Virginia now is a positive move forward. And in terms of other things we can do, coaches and athletic trainers have to be sticklers about head injuries. Some coaches still have that old school mindset that I used to have, power through it. And they really have to be very thorough about recognizing the symptoms. One thing the state of Virginia does, the VHSL requires athletic coaches to go through yearly concussion training. So even though it's kind of boring going through that module every year, it is nice to have that protocol in place. I think as a coach, too, one of the biggest things that you have to deal with your players is they have a bad case of FOMO. 80% of athletes sat out for just 1 week or less after getting hit in the head. And I think a lot of players, they just assume they're going to be out for weeks and weeks. And so they don't report because they're worried that they won't get back to the game. So it's important for coaches to stress to the players that the quicker you report it, the more strict you are with yourself about the healing protocol, the quicker you'll be back in the game. And so really that 80% number is something that I would stress to my players, just to show them that, the majority of the time, almost all of the time, you will quickly be back in the game. There's also a couple organizations that have kind of popped up over this issue. Recognize to Recover is a concussion awareness organization that a lot of professional athletes are standing behind. There's also an organization, Think Taylor. This was created by Taylor Twellman, who was a professional men's soccer player who was put out of the game through a head injury. And he started the hashtag TT Pledge. It's kind of a hashtag on Twitter, where student athletes and even coaches are pledging to know the symptoms, to report the symptoms, and to take the proper protocols in terms of concussions. There's also now a Concussion Awareness Week. It's in the beginning of October, and it just passed. And it was important to me. I took to Twitter during that time and shared my story on Twitter along with the hashtags, because I really want to share kind of how just heading the ball can lead to what I have experienced, because I want people to take this seriously. So where do we go from here? I think that we really, like I said, we need to question headers in soccer and how necessary they are. And I think that if they were to ever ban headers, it would be probably decades. And because I know many soccer players are very passionate about headers and their place in the game, especially defenders and forwards. You save goals and you score goals sometimes by headers. Abby Wambach scored many goals in her record-breaking career through her head. However, I can say as a soccer player who has chosen not to head the ball anymore, I haven't had anyone score a goal as a result of it yet. Hopefully I don't jinx myself there. And I still feel like I'm an effective, successful player on the field who can help my teammates. And so for me, I've kind of made the realization that it's not worth it. So ultimately, all we can really do here is we can bring awareness to the public through things like this podcast or Twitter, sharing news articles on it. And ultimately, we have to be aware of the symptoms. We have to report the symptoms. We have to go through the healing process. And coaches, athletic trainers, people who are working with athletes regularly, they need to also enforce the rules. They need to, if they see an athlete with any of the symptoms, they cannot let them go back in the game, and they have to report it. Ultimately, I'm hoping that with the research that will be done on professional players' brains, hopefully in many, many years from now, that eventually it will be conclusive that headers, they're an issue and they're not safe. And I hope that the U.S. Soccer Association will eventually continue to make changes in the right direction that will protect the brains of soccer players, especially female soccer players who are experiencing more concussions. So, thank you guys for listening. Hopefully, now you are more aware of the signs. If you have children who play sports, you might be more aware of some of the symptoms if they face them. If you're a coach or an athletic trainer checking in today, then I hope that you'll join me in being a little tougher on the kids in terms of the head injuries. And in our next episode of strongHER, we're going to look at supplements, various workout supplements, and how they affect your body and your muscles before, during, and after a workout.